Hey, what's going on everybody? This is Thomas Van Kempen once again, here with a different kind of video. You may have thought this was a Let's Animate, but quite to the contrary, this is something a little bit different. I was actually requested in the comments of my wolf morphing video by a YouTuber that goes by the name of Olympic Popel, or Popel, which are one of the two. Basically, they requested that I go through how I make my backgrounds and also how I animate everything and stuff like that. So I'm just going to break down how I made this scene in particular and how you can go about doing more or less the same thing. So without further ado, let's get started. As you can probably see at the bottom of the screen, I've got tons of layers to work with, probably more than necessary if I'm honest. But yeah, I'm just going to approach this one at a time. I'm going to show you the different layers of the background and how I made them. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so I'm going to turn off all the visuals for those, and now I'm going to go to the sky. So this is the very bottom layer, and this is supposed to be the sky here. Basically, it's just a box with a radiant color fill in the middle. That's pretty much all there is to it, so I'll show you what I mean by that. So what I did was I make a box like that, and then I go ahead and make that box, and then I give it a fill. And I just filled it with that green color just now. Now, here you can actually edit the color to be whatever you want. You see in this little box here where my mouse is pointing, that's currently the green color. If I actually go into the editing mode for this color and then I just fiddle around with it for a little bit, you can see it's changing colors in real time. Before I go any further, I should just establish that I'm actually working in Toon Boom Animate 3. I imagine other softwares can do this exact thing, like Adobe Flash and stuff like that. I couldn't tell you how to do the exact same thing in those softwares, because I don't know the actual tool specifics of those, but chances are you can do it. I'd be amazed if you couldn't. Anyway, moving right along back on track. Right now we're working with a solid color, but you can change it to a gradient. And then with where my mouse is pointing here, hopefully you can see that, you can actually fiddle with the gradient options there. You can either make the green more prominent, or you can make the blue more prominent if you want. And you can just fiddle around like that. You can also do this to the other side. You can add in another color if you want to, a third color, and you can do all sorts of crazy stuff like that. If you don't want this, here's what I actually did to make like this sun effect over here. You turn it to radial, which by filling in this little dot right here. And as you can see, it's actually changing with a different focal point. And the way you change where the focal point is you just paint it again. So I just clicked there, so that's where everything is radiating from. I picked there, that's where everything is radiating from. You get the idea. So let's say this is where your sun or moon is. This focal point right here. You can change the colors from there on out. Let's make another nighttime, for instance. So I'm going to make the outer layer a navy blue. I'm going to make this one a bright yellow. That looks pretty good. And I'm going to make this one a pure white. Oops. Did I screw this up? Oh no, I got the colors in reverse. My bad. Here. Oh, and also if you want to switch around the palettes, you can do what I'm doing here. You can drag them in between and do that sort of thing. So yeah. And for a moon or a sun, I like to make them a little less prominent. I like to shrink them down a bit more. This actually looks more like a daytime scene than a nighttime, but you can get across the same thing. If you don't want to have a nighttime scene, you could just fiddle around with the colors to get a brighter blue. You can get like some nice sunshine in there if you want. If you go for sunshine, I suggest extending the radius a bit more. And if you want it to be a nighttime thing, change that thing to a dark blue, and bam, it's night now. Maybe make that a little less radial than what I suggested. And maybe focus in the blue more. There you go. So yeah, that's pretty neat. Now, as this stands, this is a pretty good moon. Like, honestly, you don't need to put in much more than that. But if you'd rather have a physical object right in the middle, what you can do is you can make a little circle here, like that. And if you want perfect proportions, you can hold down the Shift key to make it like perfectly whatever. You probably know what I mean by that. And you can use the transform tool to drag it over there and make it the same size and shape you want. And as I did before, you can change the color in there. I want this to be like a bit of a thing, like bit of a light yellow there, so that's what I'm going to do. And yeah, you can fill in some more yellows or some more rings in there if you want it to be like a more cartoony moon. This is basically what I did with my moon. Hang on, I'm going to turn it on over here. Yeah, honestly, that looks pretty good by itself. I might not even color that in, but just to show that you can color it in. Like that. Yeah. So, one thing I will point out is that my moon in my actual background over here, that's on a separate layer, and that's why I'm able to turn it on and off. That's really not necessary, especially if you want it to just stay like this and not do anything scrolling-wise or anything like that. If you want it to just be like this, then you can put the moon and the sky in the same thing. But yeah, that's basically the gist of how to make a sky background. That's at least how I do it with an object in the sky and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and delete all that now. So yeah, that's how you make a sky. Now then, second thing I establish is clouds, and you can see two different clouds here. So basically what I did is I just drew a basic shape, basic cloud shape, and I'll do that now to demonstrate. Excuse me. This is going to look a little bit shabby, just a quick warning, because I'm not using my tablet right now. I'm just drawing with the mouse as we're speaking. But yeah, for the purposes of this will do just fine. So you color that in. And then if you hold click on the paint tool, you'll see this stroke tool here. Again, this is Toon Boom specific. Chances are you can do the same thing with Flash, but this is how I'm just doing it with Toon Boom. So yeah, so you click on stroke, and then you can do this sort of thing. And then this message will pop up. You press OK. If you hit D, that's like an invisible line that just showed up right there, and you'll see why this is useful in a second. So if you just keep drawing these useful lines, essentially what these allow you to do is they allow you to color in a section of the cloud without drawing any more actual physical lines in there. So if I were to get the paint tool back out, bam, now we have this thing where without using actual lines that people can see, we made this thing a bit more colorful. And this makes it really easy to shade, especially if you're just using a gradient color. You'll see what I mean by that further down the road. So yeah, that's basically it for making clouds. And if you want this thing to move in real time, what you would do is you would go down to your timeline here. And right here where my mouse is hovering, this is the transform tool. And make sure the thing above it, the animate thing, make sure that's highlighted. Pick this, go here, and select a point in the timeline. So let's say I want this to be at the very beginning. And let's say I want it to move to a different direction in 1 second. You can already see it kind of moving as I scroll down the timeline. But let's say I wanted it to move up. I just established a keyframe, you can see that, and so it's sort of tweening over there. That's actually the name of the method. It's called tweening. And yeah, it's mostly useful for just animating things that are in the background that are just supposed to move slowly without changing their shape in any way. And it's good, and it's especially helpful for backgrounds if you're trying to make progress within them and stuff like that. So yeah. And you can also use the tween thing to distort the shape a little bit, like if I did this or this. Watch what happens. There you go. You see that? Pretty handy. All right. Now we're going to backtrack a little bit. I do not have any more use for that cloud, so I'm just going to get rid of it. There we go. So that's how I did the clouds. Now, you see these mountains here? Oh, so it's worth mentioning that these two clouds here are actually on separate layers again. That's because this cloud is supposed to be in front of the mountains, and this cloud is supposed to be behind them. Not only that, but they're meant to move in different directions. This one's moving to this side very slowly, and this one's moving to that side very slowly. That way you can create a better illusion of clouds just behaving cloud-like. I don't know how else to put it. So yeah, anyway, moving on to the mountains. Now, these mountains, you may have noticed, they actually have this blurring effect that nothing else in my animation has. That's because you're not actually able to do this blurring effect in Toon Boom. I'll show you how to do shading real quick in Toon Boom for basic stuff, just because not everybody has access to Photoshop, which is actually what I use the coloring in here. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let me just show you how to shade something in Toon Boom. So let's say I make this circle here. Now I want there to be let's say I fill this thing. Now let's say I want this thing to have a shading that's kind of universal with everything else, and I want the level of shading to be consistent with everything else in the picture. What I would do is I'm going to delete this filling first, and I would make another layer. I would copy this image, I would paste it in the new layer I just made, and now I have two layers where the exact same thing is shown. On the layer above, and it's useful to lock layers if you don't want anything to happen in them so that you don't draw anything in them by accident. If I choose the above layer and pick the stroke tool, and I do this sort of thing to it, press D. What I'll do then is I'll give this kind of thing to it, and I'll make this color a gradient color. What I mean by that is, if you choose this thing right here, you can control the transparency of the color shown. And I like to use like a lot of blacks because that's generally a good shading color. I'll make that a little less prominent. So yeah, and then when I show the bottom layer and color the bottom layer in, hang on. Bam! You see that? It automatically creates a darker shade of green. And the reason why this is easier is because you don't have to create like 50 billion colors down here. That's a different shade of like a certain color that you want. It's easier because if you want to make another shape with a different color in it, then I'll show you what I mean in a sec. Because I already created a gradient black, shading it is simple and it looks consistent between this one and this one, between these two poorly drawn pairs. Yeah. Anyway, hopefully that gets my point across well enough. If not, then you can shame me for how terrible a teacher I am. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and delete those layers real quick. Okay, now, as I was saying before, I'm sorry this is a bit all over the place, but, I'm just trying to go about it as I learned it. As I was saying before, these mountains here are a bit different in that there's a bit of a smudging tool. What I was trying to say before is that for those pairs I just showed, it's impossible to get that smudging thing in there across. Or maybe it isn't. Truth be told, I'm not that knowledgeable about the capabilities of Toon Boom. I'm sure I only use the bare minimum of what is possible, and I'm sure someone's going to correct me in the comments if they ever see this. But to my knowledge, this smudging effect that you see here isn't possible to do in Toon Boom. Um, and so the way I accomplished this is I actually made these mountains in Photoshop. And the way you can do that is I'm going to turn off all these layers and I'm going to make a new one again. Something I like to do, this is kind of a neat trick, is I like to make an object. I like to take that line work and I like to export that in images, and I like to make it color with transparency. This makes it so that you export a picture without it having a background. And this way, you can implement this into Photoshop. It'll appear in Photoshop without a background, and you can color it in, and you can shade it in that way. So here, I'll just go through the entire process. Might be a bit time consuming, but bear with me. In fact, if it is too time consuming, I might just cut. You know what? Yeah, I'm just going to cut it. I'll be back with you guys in a second. Okay, and we're back. So I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here. So if you go to File, and again, I'm using Toon Boom. I'm sorry if you're using something else. I go to Export, Images, and then I'm just going to save it to thumbnails, and I'm going to save it as test dummy. There we go. So yeah, make sure it's color with transparency, and make sure that you're getting the right frame. If you don't know which frame this is, in fact, I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I'm dumb and I didn't think of this earlier. So you see right here, according to my X sheet, this right here is frame 27, or 26, sorry. Make sure you export the right frame, otherwise you're not going to get this line work in there. And it doesn't matter if you have a longer exposure in the timeline, but in this circumstance, you got to make sure you're getting the right image, otherwise you're just going to make things a bit longer for yourself. It wouldn't be too inconvenient. You would just have one unnecessary picture in your memory, but, you know, it's just good to get it right the first time. So yeah, everything looks good. I have frame 26 to 26. This makes it so I only get one picture instead of several. I've got color with transparency. I'm going to have it as a PNG. And it's going to be saved to my thumbnails as test dummy. Alright, so let's go ahead and do that. Perfect. And now we're going to go to Photoshop. I just made a new file in Photoshop. I did that off camera. So I'm going to open. Let's go to thumbnails. It looks like I'm already searching here, so that's good. It should be under test dummy. Where are you, test dummy? There you are. So there's my line work right there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drag that over here. And here it is in a new file. I can change the size if I want to. Perfect, just like that. And then I'm going to apply transformation. Now the line work is still all good. And now what happens is if I make another layer, this is going to be my coloring layer. I can color this sucker in. I'm going to make it red. Or pink. Oh yeah, my opacity is way low. I can color it like that, and it doesn't interfere with my line work. And I'm going to do a better job of coloring it in. I'm not going to do it like a friggin' kindergartner. So you may be wondering, why go through all this trouble to implement the Toon Boom line work to Photoshop? Why not just do the line work in Photoshop and then color underneath that? Well, the simple answer to that is the line work in Toon Boom is better, and it'll end up matching the rest of everything you have in your animation way more. The problem with Photoshop's brush tool is that it's not as smooth. You can't control the smoothing of it as much, and it's made for the sole. It's a little bit blurrier because it's made for the sole purpose of editing photos, obviously. So it's only a secondary function to serve as a background maker for animated cartoons. And even then, I don't think many people do it unless you're an internet animator. But yeah. essentially what this allows you to do is it allows you to implement the line work for Toon Boom, which will end up matching your cartoon way more, and it'll allow you to use the line work of Toon Boom to create much smoother lines. Obviously not as smooth as this, but still. It just allows you to create a more cartoony look and more consistent look with everything else that you're drawing in Toon Boom. So yeah, kind of sloppily colored in, but for its purposes, this will do just fine. So make another layer. This is going to be your shading layer. I'm going to use a black. I'm going to turn the opacity way down. And as you can see, now we have a darker shade of that red. It's actually much darker. In real life, I'd probably use a lighter shade than this, but whatever. For these purposes, it's fine. And now, what you do to get that blurring effect that you saw in these mountains here, just get that blurring effect you see in those mountains, you are going to use the smudge tool. And I'm admittedly pretty sloppy when it comes to this. You should get really good practice with this because it ends up just looking way better with practice. And you can make multiple layers if you want to kind of create this more what's the word I'm looking for? This cleaner like looking shading than what I'm doing here. I'm going to say it over and over, pretty sloppy in comparison to what's actually accomplishable. But yeah, I never claimed to be an expert. This is just what I do, and with enough practice, you can be way better than this abomination I'm creating right now. Obviously, I'm not this sloppy when creating actual products, but that's just how I made the mountains in my wolf morphing animation. So yeah, now, as you can see, there's a background layer right here, this white background here. If you turn that off, you make this an image without a background. And that way, you can save this. I'm going to save as. And I'm just going to save it as a JPEG. I'm going to save it as test dummy. Oops. Test dummy. I'll save it as a JPEG. If you want it to be an object in your background and not the background itself, it's absolutely important to turn the background of Photoshop off, and you'll see why in a second. Because this is a transparent background, and so you'll just implement the image itself without actually getting the white background behind it. Because if we were to leave the background layer on, we would just get this object with a white rectangle behind it, and that wouldn't be good. So now we're going to import an image rather than export. We're going to browse, and I'm going to just search test dummy. I'm sure it'll show up in here somewhere. Come on. Should be this one. Yep. Yeah, there's that crappy apple that looks like it's slowly being possessed by a disease. So I implement that. Oh, I failed here. Well, good grace, I'm embarrassed. I think this is a great tutorial series where I just fail immediately. Here. Damn it. Oh dear. Hang on. I gotta backtrack because I am a silly man. Alright. So I screwed up a bit. I'm gonna try exporting it as something else, or saving it as something else. Maybe JPEG is not the way to go. Maybe what you actually want is a PNG file. That'll probably end up working out better for you. Like I said, I'm kind of an amateur. I forget these things every once in a while. I'll probably get better at this over time. But yeah, I swear I'm competent. Pfft. Too late now. Come on. There we go. So let's try this again. Hopefully I don't friggin' eat my own words this time. Okay, so test dummy. Now, which one of these is the PNG file? Not that one. There we go. This. Okay, hopefully this one works out better. Yeah, there we go. That's what I meant to do. All right, perfect. Perfect. So yeah, that way you can implement this without the background. Make sure it is a PNG file, not a JPEG. That was me being a dummy, thinking that would work when it clearly doesn't. Yeah, and you can't do anything to really modify this in Toon Boom. You can't like animate it in a certain degree or anything. All you can do is really tween it. So I'll show you an example. I'm going to put the mic down. Okay. So let's say I just want this to move slowly to the right, like those mountains are doing. I just pick where I want it to stop in the timeline, and then I make sure these are on. It creates a keyframe for me, so when I cycle through it, bam, it's tweening over there. So it's perfect. Okay, hopefully that gets my point across. I'm going to delete these layers here because their work is done. So yeah, there we go. So here's a ground. There's really not much to say about this. It's just a square filled in with a solid color. That's pretty much all you need. These are what I like to call anime speed lines. Now, these are great when you want to articulate fast motion and continuing progress in an animation. So what you do is you go to this and you animate the lines, kind of doing different poses and stuff like that. And what I would advise you to do, I'm going to turn the onion skin on for a second. What I advise you to do is place the lines according to where they last were and where they're going to be, if that makes any sense. So these lines are supposed to be moving to the right. So they're originally here. A couple of them move over there, and these guys are actually appearing on screen, like right now. It's implied that they're coming in from the left, and now they're going to show up on screen super fast. And they just continue going to the right again and again. And eventually, you get back to the same image here. This image in the timeline here is actually the same as this one. That's because you want this to loop. So you don't just create like 50,000 different images of speeding lines. What you do is, here, I'll show you in another layer. Let's say you want one speed line. What you do is you do that. You give it a couple of frames. I'm just going to give it 5 for now. And then you delete all these guys in between. And then with the onion skin tool, this red thing shows you where it previously was. So if I want it to move to the right, I'm going to make another one like this. And I'm going to make another line here. This line will become this line later down the road, if that makes any sense. So, gonna keep doing that. Make this one longer. And if you control the onion skin like this, the green lines represent the picture that's going to happen after the picture you're currently in. So put in another line there. Put in another line there. Bam. Okay, so that should work well enough for these purposes. So this last picture that's supposed to be the same as this one, delete that. And then what you do is you highlight all these pictures by holding Shift and going from right to left. Then you right click, you create cycle, this will create a loop, and then you enter in how many times you want this to loop over and over again. If you want it to loop for the entire thing like I do, I would just say enter in a ridiculously high number. So I'm going to say 50. It's not really going to show all 50 times, so like it ends at some point, but just to make sure like it loops for the entirety of the scene, you're going to want to make sure that it's a high number so that the entire timeline is filled in. So that's not the best example. This is actually a better example right here because it's actually the speed lines behaving like speed lines. But yeah, that's essentially how you create a loop. And you can use that same principle for other things different from speed lines. You can use it for run cycles. You can use it for scrolling backgrounds. In fact, I'll show you different aspects of this scrolling background in a sec. I did essentially the same thing for this rock here. Okay, this rock is different. That's actually just a tween. Here. You see that tiny rock right here? This rock is actually also operating in a loop. So it goes there, then there, then there, and once it reaches all the way to the end, you see how this green one shows how another one is going to show up in this picture here? Basically, you just show this rock going from left to right in the screen over and over and over and over and over again with basically the same principle. And I have a different example, a more complicated one. Believe it's this guy right up here. This is a collection of rocks that's going by rather quickly. This is a bit more complicated because it's more than one object, but it's basically the same concept. It just goes over and over, and you can keep track of where the rock placement would be based on like the pattern that they go in, if that makes any sense. So basically, if your very last frame before the loop ends is right there, then you have to think yourself like, where should this be in relation to the first frame here? And that way you'll create like a seamless loop where it looks like it's just going infinitely. And when you play it, it really does look like, it looks like a long string of basically the same thing going by, but it's not. It's just a short string going by and an endless loop over and over. Hopefully I've articulated that enough. I apologize if I haven't. This is the first time I've ever done a tutorial video, so hopefully this is helpful. So yeah. And I think I'm just going to keep this strictly to a background tutorial series. If you want me to do more tutorial series on different things like how to articulate movement of a wolf, then I guess I can do that. But yeah, and here's how it all comes together. I'm going to play through this real quick for you. My computer's lagging a little bit, so I might just play through it again. Oh yeah, this is the looping one. So, don't just ignore this section here. Oh man. Just trying to get it to play properly. Okay, I think you get the idea though. That's how everything sort of comes together. Now, if you have a vast background like this with plenty of foreground where it's clear that some objects are closer to the camera than others, my advice when creating a running scene like this is make the guys closer to the camera move the fastest and make everything farthest from the camera move the slowest. So these guys right up here, these rocks up here, they are closest to the camera, and so they are moving the quickest. They are moving from left to right the quickest out of everything here. This rock here, it's much farther away, but it's still the second closest thing, or the third closest thing if you count the wolf. And so it's going by at a pretty quick pace too. Not quite as fast, but still. This rock here is going at a slower pace because it's behind this one. And these mountains, because it's implied that they're super, super far away, they move at a glacial pace. Like, you can tell that they're just barely moving. And it creates this really dynamic shot where it creates more perspective on things that are moving in relation to each other. Because if you look at real life, oftentimes when a bunch of things are moving at the same time, the perception of how fast they're moving is affected by how close they are to you, especially if you're keeping track of one thing that's moving right in center frame, like this wolf here. So that's how everything sort of comes together. So yeah, I think that's all I'm going to cover for this tutorial series. I hope this was helpful. Olympic Popel. I know I was sort of all over the place, never really done this before, but if you want me to go more into more stuff like that, like the wolf running or the morphing and stuff like that you see in this, I'd be happy to go into that. Alright, thank you guys for tuning in. This is easily the worst tutorial on the internet. I'll see you in the next video. Okay, see you later.